here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. The United Nations General Assembly makes a virtual gathering in New York, marking the UN's 75th anniversary. Heads of state and government are addressing the session via video instead of in person, a first in UN history because of COVID-19 pandemic. In recent years, the UN and its founding principles are under threat with the rise of unilateralism, protectionism, and in no small part, troubles with the pandemic. In a declaration adopted by the meeting, the UN vowed to strengthen its three pillars: peace, security, development, and human rights. Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the meeting, calling on all countries to stick to multilateralism and give equal weight to the voice of the developing world. For more on the ongoing UN General Assembly, we are joining Washington, D.C. Surya Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. Welcome, sir. In Brussels, Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center. And in Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, academic dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. As we speak, the General Assembly are still convening, and we are seeing heads of state and government are making their virtual talk, and Chinese President Xi Jinping is on the line later for today's delivery of his speech. Having said that, though, the head of state, Mr. Gupta, already made their rounds yesterday, and certainly a lot of words were exchanged and ideas as well about multilateralism and how to approach that from now on. Your take?
Yes, there was a lament yesterday that multilateralism needs to be revitalized, that the United Nations has played a very important role over the past 75 years, even though it's not been an unblemished role, but that the multilateralism we have today cannot cope with the world system that we have today. Multipolarity has far outrun multilateralism, and therefore it needs to be given a reset, a reboost, so that it can face up to the challenges of today and for the next 75 years. All the leaders, I think, had a consensus around this view. There's also the view that to get multilateralism to where it needs to be, one needs to reimagine it again, so that all parties, as you mentioned, even the small and developing countries, become equal stakeholders within the system.
I see. Professor Fu, about multilateralism, of course, Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized once and again, but what can be China's contribution to that?
Well, if we look at the history of the United Nations from then on and come all the way today, and the world probably has produced more than all human history has produced. And one critical reason for that is interconnectivity. And we are talking about the global value chains, and as a derivative, logically, you have to emphasize multilateralism. Now, China has been a beneficiary of the UN multilateral system. So, to sort of in the form of giving back, China will continue to emphasize multilateralism. Now, to give you some figures, 40 years ago when we started reforms, our average GDP amount is 150 US dollars. Now it's 10,000, and it's because of the system undergirded by multilateralism, and that had helped China to grow as well. We have learned positive lessons from multilateralism, and to help the whole global system, we need to continue to emphasize the same theme, multilateralism, on the advanced economy, on the less advanced economies.
I see. Mr. Cameron, though, the UN Secretary General have been talking about the lessons that we should learn from the past and also the test for this generation. The earlier generation have been mainly over the past 75 years safeguard the world's peace so that no worldwide hot war ever happened then. But now there is a danger, Mr. Cameron.
Well, I don't think there's a danger of any sort of global conflict. I think for much of a time during the Cold War, there was a genuine threat of a nuclear holocaust. That, I think, is no longer the case. The challenges are very different now. The challenges are more to do with climate change, with the question of sustainable development. That's what the younger generation are certainly focusing on. And at the same time, everyone's talking about the need for more multilateralism, but the trend around the world is towards more nationalism. So I think we have to look to curb nationalist tendencies and put the emphasis back on the multilateral. But that's not an easy task. That will take time.
It will take time, and where to start with. For example, globalization, of course, there's a lot of debate about that, but with the global supply chain and global value chain, those are still existing, and those are still the interest lines that holds every country in. And Mr. Cameron, will that be a battleground to safeguard multilateralism? To what degree, though?
Well, business has been a huge beneficiary, as has most of the population, including in China, of globalization. There's been a backlash, obviously, in the last couple of years. You see that in the United States, but in other countries as well, saying, well, many of the workers have not benefited from this, and therefore we're going to pull up the drawbridge. Pulling up the drawbridge is not the answer. It's obviously making sure that multilateralism works for all. You have to ensure that everyone abides by the rules, agrees what the rules are first. And I think that is the primary task now of world leaders. They're reaffirming this week their commitment to multilateralism. They have to translate that into real action, for example, on WTO reform. That's a good example.
Well, that example is already a hard battle, right? It's an uphill battle. All of you know that very well, Mr. Gupta. When the biggest power of the world, namely the United States, yes, I'm naming the name right now, is not necessarily thinking multilateralism should be the way, at least for this administration. Will the others be able to hold up to that banner still? Your take?
I think it will be very difficult for the others to hold up to the banner, because it's only now that we are getting to understand the extent to which the US has underwritten the system for so long. And unfortunately, the US has this Lone Ranger attitude these days. It's my way or the highway. And ironically, the US is willing to go down its own highway if it doesn't get its own way. And it's going to be a difficult challenge for the other countries. But it's important that the main blocs, China, the European Union, and Japan, the countries which are still very committed to multilateral ways, that they get their relations right, so that even if the United States is not an active participant within the system, at least the system can be consolidated and upheld. But at the end of the day, I think we will absolutely need US participation, but we should not discount the fact that if we look from it from a large historical perspective, that the US is so engaged internationally and multilaterally is frankly an aberration in its history. And so we should look at the days when there is a possibility that the US could be far more isolationist than today. So, of course, this is not great news, but it's a challenge we must face up to.
Mr. Gupta, you raised a very interesting point, which is what kind of country is the United States by nature through history? Of course, we're going to debate about that, but that's probably a minor issue. And yet, what you mentioned about either geopolitics and also about economic and trade ties, how it will have an impact. Professor Fu, we see geopolitically, now China and EU countries are suggesting about the issue of Iran. And even some of the European nations were suggesting if the United States is not part of the deal anymore, it should not push for a multilateral sanction against Iran because it's just not entitled to. Then also on the trade side, you see Japan is probably leading a role earlier on TPP, which is a multilateral platform, even though China is not part of it yet. But think about it, it seems that there are very different drifting apart, and yet the drifting apart from the US are done in a way that's multilaterally to a certain extent. Professor Fu, how should we observe this?
I tend not to use the words of categorical words. It's black and white.
No.
And even when we look at the United States, we need to look at a historical trend. In the wake of the Second World War, when United States was so big after the system, the Second World War system, including United Nations, World Bank, and others, its economic share of the total world share was as high as 45, probably close to 50%. And of course, with that share of economy, and what you see is reaching out everywhere. It's multilateral. Now, over the years, the U.S. share has been dwindling. It's not declining, but as a share, because other parts of the world has been growing. Now, probably its share is standing at 25%. And now compare that with China. 40 years ago, less than 5% of the total share of the world GDP. Now it's probably around 15%. So we are going from a weak power moving to a more powerful, at least in terms of the economy. The U.S., relatively speaking, is declining. So in that sense, probably I would expect the United States to be looking.
You're talking about the ultimate power in terms of economic power. What I'm saying is an interesting trend. If it's not a coincidence, we see geopolitically on the issue of Iran, for example, countries besides the United States are relatively trying to figure out a way together. Well, also on the issue of TPP, for example, which is a multilateral platform, even though some big powers are not part of it, but still it is a trade and economic platform with the U.S. absent, and not to mention WHO and some of the other things.
Oftentimes we sort of divide economics and politics, but intellectually, probably it's a way to start with. But in reality, it's a political economy. So even geopolitical consideration need to consider the economic side first. Then what's demonstrated is sort of different parts of the world coming together.
They are certainly intertwined. Mr. Cameron, what about your take? Some of the interesting trends, or they are just sporadic issues?
Well, the trends can be contradictory. I mean, for example, let's just take the next couple of months. If we have a change of administration in Washington, you will see a very different approach of the United States to the multilateral system. I think, too, that we have to ensure that the leading powers, someone said this before, basically the US, China, European Union, these are the top three economic giants, if you like, must try and ensure that they coordinate more. Then there's the second level countries, Japan, India. On the economic side, Brazil, other members of the G20, who need to try and ensure that we are all working on the same page in some of these big challenges. I mean, as I said before, the most important one for the younger generation is climate change, but in the South it would be sustainable development, a more equal world, if you like. So I think we have to try and focus not on every issue, but try and ensure there is some sort of consensus on the 3 or 4 priority issues, and let's try and achieve something together over the next few years to show the world that the multilateral system works.
Action, action, and action. That's what's going to really count. Because no matter what we talk about or what logic, concepts we illustrated, only action that's going to really lead the results. Mr. Gupta, how much action do you see the rest of the world besides the United States have been realizing that they have to take?
I think the rest of the world realizes that they do need to take action, that there need to be deliverables. It's always hard to get to the point where action is finally translated into results. But we are beginning to see countries move in that direction. For example, as you mentioned, in terms of the TPP, who would have thought that Japan could have taken the leadership role in that and taken that over the line? But that is in fact what they did manage to do. Even as you talked about the Iran case, the Iran nuclear issue, and the UN. It has been disappointing that the EU could not push a little harder back against the US and actually do a lot of trade with Iran. But at least they've been able to hold the line until then, along with Russia and China. And again, talking in terms of action out here, in terms of, the EU and China had a summit recently, and I think China made staked out important positions in terms of reform of industrial subsidies and in basically in transitioning to a new form of economic model. And I think these are small things, but these are also when done consistently over the long term, can translate into important actions. So we are seeing actions in that way. A lot of developing countries are taking important steps, important commitments in terms of climate change. And yes, because climate change is so existential, it seems that it's not sufficient. And yes, action needs to become more robust and more bolder. But I would say that most countries understand that we are all in together, and they're taking the actions that need to be taken, though we need to strengthen that process.
Professor Fu.
Well, this is not to belittle action. Action is very important, but to act in the right direction. And to do that, we need to have a good concept. And I tend to agree with our European colleague when he mentioned climate change. We need to have priorities conceptually. Global challenge, climate change, and the short term, we have the pandemic, then the global value chain, what have you. And with those clear concepts, then we all agree to that, and we take action to reduce those threats and to expand where we can and to continue to grow the global economy.
Let's talk about the specifics all of you have been eager to focus on. First of all, pandemic, and then we have, also global fight against poverty. Now we even have food shortage in some parts of the world as a result of the pandemic. And of course, fighting against the pandemic itself. And then of course, the climate change, and not to mention the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030, which has been adopted by the UN, which means all of us together have been adopting those goals as the goal for all of us by the year 2030. And we are not far from there. So, Mr. Cameron, with so many global issues actually urgently need consensus and concerted efforts, starting from the vaccine and the distribution of vaccine. Where are we? Are we too little, too late? I'm a journalist, so I try to look at both sides.
I don't think anybody knows where we are yet with the vaccine. There's so many different pharmaceutical companies trying to be first. I think many countries have said they will not treat this as a national issue, but ensure it will be international. But inevitably, whoever brings forward the vaccine first will have to put priorities on it. It won't be able to cover everybody in the world instantly. But I think, that is an obvious example where the world has to cooperate here. And you mentioned, I think, the Human Development Goals. I think the world has been cooperating quite well on that, and I think there's been progress made. So these are probably the two, plus climate change, that I think you have a consensus on at the moment. And I think these are probably three issues we could all really say these are the top priorities.
Mr. Gupta, some suggest that it is heartbreaking if we cannot come together in front of this pandemic, which has been taking away more and more lives. And of course, we believe in the power of science, and technology probably will have a reliable vaccine, but we shouldn't rely on a vaccine too much, as the realities increasingly suggest. So, Mr. Gupta, about this pandemic, where are we? Can we at least tackle this?
The countries have not done such a great job in tackling the pandemic so far. The pandemic actually is a useful example of being hit by a challenge when it's least expected and when you don't expect it. Of course, we've had the AIDS crisis, et cetera, in the 1980s, but we haven't had a pandemic on this scale in 100 years. And so while everybody had their pandemic preparedness plans, nobody really knew how to really tackle the pandemic once it really struck. What has been disappointing to me from my end is that many of the actions which could have been taken to at least contain and mitigate the pandemic were very straightforward ones in terms of wearing masks, basic hygiene. but we've seen just a basic breakdown in common sense and just discipline, and that has been the main problem. And of course, we have not had very great leadership in certain countries, in some countries on this front, and so we are where we are. But I am not too disappointed also at the same time. Science has made great steps forward, and it is sad as to the suffering that has taken place, but I'm hopeful that countries will come around and be, once the vaccine is out there. But let me also make one larger point out here. You know, part of the reason we've been really struck down by this pandemic, and we can again in future pandemics, is because, you know, human beings are now beginning to encroach in a big way on wildlife, in green spaces, and till we don't have better understanding of our own habitats and tackle climate change more seriously,
That's right.
I think we will have recurring situations like this, and so we need to focus on that area too.
Professor, we have been talking about this topic for a long time, but still some of the earlier setbacks we are also seeing once again, for example, coming back of the pandemic in some parts of the world as a result of possibly somewhat negligence. And so let's focus on the future. What would it take for all of us, at least on the same line, and say, now, let's just bind ourselves together and be able to overcome at least the short-term challenges together?
Well, ultimately, we need to develop a vaccine, some type of vaccines. But what if the virus mutates? Then probably a cocktail of vaccines. But as you mentioned, the science is important, but scientific knowledge is all a matter of probability. It's not 100% certain. Scientific knowledge progresses funeral by funeral. Now, there are difficult, probably I should say, political judgment to make for the authorities. They have to weigh risks. Now, for a normal vaccine, it needs to go through a long period, 3 period of time. Can we shorten that period because of the severity of the virus coming? And probably countries need to balance between the two. When we inject vaccines, there are also risks of side effects.
So it is important to wait for the 3 stages of trials for the general public. Of course, emergency use is another issue.
We have, many countries have already speeded up the process.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of you gentlemen joining us. Surya Gupta, Fraser Cameron, and Fu Jun. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Really appreciate it. Thank you.